Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a game designer of all varieties, from video games to board games. Please welcome the one and only Scott Rogers to Epic Realms. How are you doing, Scott?
Hello, it's nice to be here in the realms.
I love it. A mutual friend had connected the two of us, and I was very excited to get you on the show. Often when we get guests who do all kinds of different things, the same question usually comes up, that chicken or the egg sort of situation. For you, what came first when you were a kid growing up? Were you first introduced to board games or video games growing up?
Well, I am old, so video games were almost not a thing when I was little. Um, they were invented commercially in the 70s, early 70s, and I was born just a little bit before that. So I predate the video game industry, but I don't predate video games. I used to teach history of video games, so I unfortunately know a little too much about this stuff. But really, for me, it was board games first. One of my earliest memories was playing a board game called Green Ghost. It had this phosphorescent glow that kind of lit us all of our faces up as we were playing the game. And I have that image kind of burned into my memory. And I, growing up, I had a lot of board games and was always interested in board games, and then migrated over to the Dungeons and Dragons, and then video games really kicked in. I discovered D&D like right before video games became big, and then I got pulled in. So for me, when like birthdays and Christmases would roll around, usually I was either asking for Dungeons and Dragons modules and supplies, or I was asking for a video game system. And the video game systems were always a little too expensive, so I think I ended up getting more D&D stuff than video games.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that though. Endless
No,
entertainment with D&D, and
yeah, yeah, make your own game, right?
right? And heck, you could probably pull that stuff out now and still use it. Whereas the video games, it's like, well, they're a little bit dated these days. Some of them, they're still fun. We do retro games from time to time.
Yeah, you got to find the right hookups, right? It's always a real pain in the butt to, oh, these require, I don't even remember the names of those things anymore, but
Right,
half the TVs can't even accommodate them anymore.
right. You have to get like converters
Yep.
and whatnot. What was it that grabbed your attention to board games as opposed to like movies or any kind of other entertainment, other kinds
Oh,
of
I
toys?
I still love toys and I still love movies. So that was still a big part of my childhood. You can kind of see behind me, I've got plenty of toys. But what I like about board games is that they are toyetic. They're tactile. They're little miniature worlds. Particularly when I started to get into Dungeons and Dragons, I was really big into miniatures, and there was no real scenery yet, like nothing official. But we would kind of block out our own stuff on either map paper or with whatever we had kind of laying around the house. And I like that. I like that idea of like you're overlooking a world in miniature. That's part of the fun for me of board games, is that seeing the world kind of getting built out and your little characters interacting with it in different ways. So you have games like, Hero. I never played Hero Quest as a child, actually. I didn't get a copy until later in life. But Dungeons and Dragons, and there were plenty of other games that I owned as a child that had kind of that created that kind of effect.
Yeah. Did you make your own games as a kid? Because I
Oh,
know me, when I
absolutely.
started to get into board games, I was like, hey, I can get this flat piece for Legos and I can make like a board game out of Legos and design a, adults had no idea what I was coming up with, but still.
Well, I mean, there was always those kind of racetrack, the Candyland style map board games that everybody would make, and those were what a lot of the board games of that era were.
Right.
They were like licensed things like James Bond and Batman and whatnot. Um, but when I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, I started to buy. Um, TSR had a line of uh, they were known as micro games, but I'm trying to think of they had a special name for TSR had a special name for them. But these were games like Vampire and Assault on Antares and the Alamo, yeah, remember the Alamo or Siege of the Alamo or something like that. Anyway, they were these very small, like they came in a very thin um, container, plastic container. They kind of almost like a clamshell, and they had a booklet and usually a map, and then they had a sheet or two of chits, chits being little cardboard
Yeah.
squares. And most of them had the information for the game pre-printed on them, but sometimes they kind of ran out of stuff to put, right? They had more pieces, there are less pieces, more spots than they had pieces. And
Yeah.
so they have these blank chits left over. And I had enough of these games that I actually had a pretty sizable collection of blank chits. And so I had a younger brother who's 9 years younger. And so I would design games for him, and I would draw. I'd get a very, very small tip pen, and I would draw characters and stats and things on these chits. And then I'd make a board. I'd take some paper and I'd make a board or something. And I remember creating a game system, and it's a shame I just don't have it anymore. But it was it was almost like a universal game system with a map. It was like a modular map that you could. I made like 5 or 6 different themed IP for my brother, but it was all things he was into. So it was like Indiana Jones and GI Joe and Inspector Gadget and stuff like that. And so I had this game, this modular game you could play with any, mix and match the pieces or whatever. And it worked really well. It was a kind of a dungeon crawly type game, and yeah, I remember spending a lot of time making those games and playing them with my brother.
Did you spend time like working on this kind of stuff in school or playing it in school? How
No,
was
no.
school involved in any of that kind of
Well,
stuff, or not at all?
D&D was involved in school
Okay.
because I went to a Lutheran junior high school, and that's right around the time I discovered D&D in like 1978. I was in the Boy Scouts, and I was on a camping trip, and I discovered D&D. And so I brought it home, and for birthdays was like, that's, what I want. Give me, it could have the manuals and the modules and
Yeah.
dice and things like that. So I could play with my friends. And then we started playing at school. And then of course this was like right at the start of the craze, right? The satanic panic
Yeah.
that went around. And so we are at a Christian school playing this, so-called, demonic board game. Well, not even board game, it's table role playing game. And so me and my fellow players, we like marched over to the pastor who ran the school, and we were like, look, this is a game about imagination. It's not a game about summoning demons. You could have it be about summoning demons, but that's not what the game is telling you to do. The game is telling you to have these adventures. And we were like, look, it's no different than Lord of the Rings or Conan or the Chronicles of Purdain books, and we had all those books in our school library. So
Right.
we're like, well, if they're in the school library, how can it be bad, right? And
Right.
and so we convinced the pastor not only to let us play on school grounds, like at recesses and lunch breaks and that, but we also actually he was like, all right, well then I want you to run a game in the class for me and the teacher and all the students. And I'm like, well, I have to break it up into, there were like 30 students. So I'm like, I can't run a 30-person game, but we can break it up into like little squads of 5 or 6. And so I was all ready to run this very epic dungeon. And I was also very big into like traps. And
Yeah.
I'd seen Indiana Jones, and, that first 15 minutes of that movie ruined every Dungeon and Dragons campaign that I ever made. And so I was all ready to do something like this. And then I ended up the teacher was like, all right, we're going to assign who the tables, who's at the tables. And so my friends got, all our other friends who were interested, and I got the table full of girls. Now, that's not to say girls can't play Dungeons and Dragons, but girls were definitely not, even back then, interested in like killing orcs and raiding dungeons and all that. So I very quickly had to pivot to them having to find, I think they were trying to find a Pegasus or something like that. That was their, I figured girls like horses, and so let's have them go after a horse. So that was part of I simultaneously defended Dungeons and Dragons against the onslaught of the zeitgeist at the time where everybody thought it was bad.
Yeah.
And I also learned how to, as a dungeon master, how to pivot very quickly for my players. And so
Right.
it was D&D. I have a lot to thank D&D for, actually. I don't think I would have been a game designer for a living if there wasn't for D&D.
That's really awesome. Did you end up going to college and doing anything as far as
Yeah,
that
I
goes?
mean, well, I did go to college. I have two degrees, one in fine art with an emphasis in illustration, and one in filmmaking with an emphasis in screenwriting.
Okay.
And I thought that originally, so as a kid, I wanted to be a comic book artist. I grew up
Right.
in San Diego, where the San Diego Comic Con was, and but I after a few years of going to Comic Con as like a kind of a young teen and showing my artwork off, everybody was super supportive, but all the pros. So I would hang out with guys like John Romita and Carl Barks, and guys like Jack Kirby were there and all that. This was, again, the 70s,
Right.
early 80s. They would tell me these horror stories about the comic book industry, how terrible it was to work in it, and how, they didn't pay you enough, and they won't give you credit for creating characters and all this and that. And I'm like, this sounds terrible. I don't want to work in this. So then Star Wars came out, and I had gotten for Christmas the book called The Art of Star Wars, and in it it had the screenplay, but it also had storyboards and it had concept art,
Yeah.
and that I was like, oh, I could draw. I could still do the same thing that I like to do, which is to draw cartoons and comic strips and all that, but I could do it for the film industry. And so I started to kind of work my way towards doing that. My first job as a 15-year-old paying job was to do storyboards for a low budget sci-fi film. And Anyway, eventually that's what I thought I would do. So my career path was leading towards film industry, either screenwriting or storyboarding or concept art or something like that. Um, but it didn't end up that way. That's not where it went.
But I'm sure you got a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge that did help you from that, right?
It did, but even more importantly, many years later, when I was working as a video game designer, I had a realization that everything I was interested in and everything I had learned as a child really was pointing me towards a career in game design. But I didn't realize it until like around 1996 or so.
Yeah. Looking back, is there anything from your time in college that you use all the time and you're like, man, that one piece of information or that one thing I learned or that one trick I use it all the time. Is there anything like that?
Not to knock my teachers, but I don't feel like I really I got where I went to school is a very good school, but I don't feel like I really I came across teachers that were very draconian, and they weren't, if you weren't doing kind of what everybody else was doing, they weren't very supportive of you. And so I ran into several situations where I kept getting discouraged by, that's part of the reason why I switched into the film degree, was because I was getting just not great feedback from my teachers. The best thing to come out of college for me was making the friends I made,
Okay.
because a lot of them have gone on to also worked in the game industry. Some of them are very famous, and it was those contacts that it really nobody helped me get a job in it. Well, no, that's not true. One fella, Stu Rose, did. He was the one that got me into the game industry accidentally. But then eventually I would meet other, oh yeah, we went to school together, or we were whatever, there's a lot, it's a very small industry for how big it is.
Yeah, for sure. What was it that got you first looking at video games? Because you mentioned you had D&D and all of that.
Mhm.
What was it that got you looking at video games as like, oh, this would be a good career, and shifting your focus over to that?
So like I said, I looked at comic books, I looked at actually had interned in the film industry. I worked on television shows, I worked on low budget films, and but one of the things that just became really clear to me was the amount of hustling you had to do in between gigs. Like you do your gig, you're like, woo, okay, that's done. And then like you had to get back into it. And there's a lot of, ass kissing. Am I allowed to swear on this? Okay. Anyway, yeah, so there was a lot of that. And I didn't like that.
Yeah.
And so I was working in animation when I graduated, and there's a tradition in the animation industry they do every year, which is at Christmas they lay everybody off. And so I was unemployed, and I was in a coffee house, and I was drawing in my sketchbook, and my friend Stu, who I knew from the college newspaper, we were both cartoonists on the newspaper together.
Oh, okay.
He was like, "Oh, Scott, you know how to draw, right?" I said, "Yes, I'm doing it right now." And he said, "Do you know how to draw on a computer?" And I said, well, what do you mean? Because I know how to use Photoshop and that. And he says, no, there's these other programs called Deluxe Paint and Deluxe Animator that we use at this company I work for, and we're looking for people to do art. And I said, oh, well, I don't know those programs. And he said, well, I'll cut you a deal. I'm usually at work, but I have a computer at home and it has these programs on it. For the next 2 weeks, I'll let you borrow a key to my apartment. You can come over and teach yourself how to do this, make a reel, and then you can come in and interview for the job. I'm like, I'm not doing anything else.
Yeah.
That's a very generous offer. I will do that. So I did that, and I spent those 2 weeks learning and then creating. And I finally went into the company for an interview. They had just shipped like kind of one of their first big titles. They were working on a really cool looking game for the PC. I interviewed with them. They said, Scott, we really like you. We like your art, but unfortunately, we just gave that job away to somebody else. And I said, all right, well, I'm sorry to hear that, but good luck with your game. And off I went. And that company was at the time known as Silicon and Synapse. And a few years later, they changed their name to Blizzard. And I would have been the 16th employee of Blizzard if I had been hired there when I interviewed. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case, and my career would have been very different if I'd worked for Blizzard.
Yeah.
I'd probably have a sword and a shield and all that fun stuff. Um,
You mean you
but
don't have a sword and a shield?
no, well, I don't have a shield. I think I have a sword laying around somewhere. But it's not a Blizzard sword.
Yeah.
And anyway, but what I did have was a reel of artwork and animations that I could take to another place. And my roommate found an ad in the LA Times, and they were looking for video game artists in San Diego, which is where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so I said, oh, okay, I'll go back home and I'll see if I can get this job. And I did. And that kind of started my career as a video game artist, but not as a video game designer.
Yeah. But eventually, I mean, you've worked for a long list of gaming companies, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to list through a few. You can tell me if I'm wrong on some of them because sometimes the internet lies to me. Namco, Camcom, THQ,
Capcom, yeah.
Sony, Disney.
Yeah,
Are these all accurate? You've worked for all those
yeah,
companies?
yeah, Capcom, Namco, Sony, Disney. I've worked also for a few other. I worked for a company called Spaces that did kind of VR stuff, and I just finished up working for a company called the Game Breaking Studios, which are a bunch of really smart co-dev guys. So yeah, I've been fortunate enough to work for some big names on some big games, and so that has definitely helped my career.
What is kind of the differences working for a big company and the big moving parts compared to working for a smaller company with just a handful of people?
Well, the interesting thing was back when I started in games, teams were moderately small. I worked on teams as small as 9 people and as large as maybe, I think God of War was the biggest game team I worked on, and that was 30 or 40 people plus a bunch of contractors, like guys doing the cinematics and things like that. So none of the teams were really huge. Like I never worked on a massive, 100+ person team. They're out there, but I haven't experienced working with them. But so yeah, things were pretty agile back then. You had to be good at doing a lot of stuff. And I was always the guy in the room that when something came up and we're like, oh, we need somebody to write a script, I would raise my hand. I said, well, I studied screenwriting in college. I'll do it.
Yeah.
Or we know we need somebody that can do the sound, get the temp sound effects and all that ready. And I said, well, I studied filmmaking and I actually was the guy that used to run the sound, the tape recorder. So, and I know how to make sound. So I'll do that. And so I just kept kind of raising my hand. And so I'm good. I jokingly say I've done everything to make a game except for code. I have been fortunate enough. I've gone 31 years in my career as a video game creator and never had to write a line of code. Well, that's not true. I've written a couple lines of code, but I'm not a programmer at all. I am a game designer, and so I kind of tell people that because sometimes in interviews they expect you to also know how to code, and I go, look, that's just not what I do. I concentrate solely on the experience of playing the game. and how to make it fun and how to make it interesting and how to make it engaging.
When you're putting together a game, talking about being engaging, there is sometimes a time where a person will be playing a game and they'll get a puzzle or mechanic or something that just doesn't fit with the theme of the game. Or sometimes you'll be playing a game and the mechanics or the puzzles or whatever fit right in and it's almost seamless. What is kind of your approach to making sure that a mechanic works well with the theme of a game?
Well, it's got to be, it has to do with the theme. It has to fit in with the theme. There are some very famous examples of puzzles and mini games and things like that that are kind of shoehorned into games, and they're in some of, like, pretty big popular games. But what I like it is when things are very much a part of the world. So for example, I'm playing a lot of Star Wars Outlaws right now, which is the kind of the Han Solo-y type of, you're a smuggler, you're a thief. And so there's a mini game, just like in every other video game, where you have to hack a computer, but the hacking in it doesn't feel forced. It feels, because the visuals match the Star Wars universe, because the they're not that hard. They're either little rhythm games, or they are crypto, what's it called, cryptography type of games, where you're essentially just trying to figure out a pattern. But the
Yeah.
pattern, you can just blindly guess it, and it's fine, and that's fine, because Star Wars is not, in my opinion, a very thinky IP.
Right.
It's meant to be more about action than it is about having to worry over a puzzle.
Right.
And so I think it fits in really nicely. So that's when I design. I'm not great at designing puzzles. For me, they're kind of the hardest part of doing a game. And so often I'll leave them up to the experts, guys like Mike Selinker, or Scott Kim, or people like that. Those guys are great. They're experts at making puzzles. So I will crib liberally from their work, and their books and all that. So
Yeah. I love Mike
you don't have.
Selinker. Mike Selinker was our first episode.
Oh,
It's
that's
a
great. Yeah,
great
yeah.
guy.
I mean, the lesson is, you don't have to. It's okay to copy, as long as you're not ripping off, right?
Right.
Like, it's okay to get inspired by other people's stuff and kind of make it similar, as long as you're not, just ripping it off whole cloth.
Yeah. Is there a theme or a type of game that you prefer to work on? Like if somebody's like, "Hey, we got these list of 10 different games, all of them
Right,
different
right.
thematically, which one are you usually gravitating towards?"
I like, first and foremost, I like third person games, either platformers or action games or things like that. The majority of the games in my career are those. I jokingly said I made a lot of games with a guy with a sword. Um, and so
But not a
I
shield,
like,
guys, not a shield. Not a
no,
Just kidding.
Maximo, no,
Going
no,
back to the Warcraft
Maximo.
joke.
Yeah, no, I know, I get it. No, Maximo, he throws the shield like Captain America.
Right, right.
Um, and I was quite fond of that series of games. Those were fun.
Yeah.
Fun to make, fun to play. Um, but yeah, I mean, mostly it's anything with a story. It has to be a theme I like. It has to be, I've always wanted to make a horror video game, but I've never had an opportunity. Well, that's not true. I helped make, um, we did a adaptation of a movie called Monster House, and the creative director on that, he was like, I want to make this game Resident Evil for kids. And so that was kind of the closest I've come to working on a horror title, was that game, Monster House. It was fun.
Okay.
But we also had to, like, stick to the movie and
Yeah.
all that. So there's always limitations when you're working on those intellectual properties.
Yeah. Is there something where like you want to put something in, then you have to like go back and get clearance from like 30 different people and then get the okay,
Sometimes.
and then maybe it
But
changes?
Well, the funniest story was, we were working on a sponge. I did a lot of SpongeBob games,
Yeah.
and one of them had Patrick, and he had an ice cream cone that he would carry around with him for the whole game, and he would throw it like, if you've played Ghosts and Goblins, he throws it like the fire brand in
Oh,
that,
okay.
so it kind of arcs, and then it splatters and hurts the monsters, the bad guys. And the people that were licensing SpongeBob from, they were like, you can't have Patrick running around with ice cream all the time because we have an anti-obesity policy at our company that we can't, we it's not good for kids to eat ice cream all the time. And if you have Patrick walking around with ice cream all the time, they're gonna eat more ice cream, I guess, or something. It was a very weird logic that they
Yeah.
had. And so I said, well, okay, I disagree with this idea, but all right, well, what do you recommend we change it to? Because we don't want to change the code. It still needs to work the way it does. It still needs to travel in an arc. It still needs to splat when it hits. What do you suggest? And they said, oh, well, what if Patrick digs up under the ground from between his legs and throws a mud ball at the enemy? And first of all, I'm like, okay, there's several reasons why we should not do this.
They're
And
worried
the
about the
first,
kids in the ice cream. What about the
well,
kids throwing mud?
yeah, well, no, worse. It when he reached between his legs, it looked like he was picking up poop and throwing poop. And so that was part of it. And the other part was that like a lot of the environments weren't outside, so him scooping up mud in like a spaceship or wherever he was in some sort of environment like that, that made no sense. Right? I'm like, it makes no sense, and B, it's gonna look like he's throwing poop. And they're like, do it anyway, please. So we did it. They took one look at the build and they went, change it back. It looks too much like he's throwing poop. So we changed it back to the ice cream, and that's what it was in the game.
I love it. I love that. That's great. What are some other challenges that you have when you're coming up and playing some of these different games, whether you're designing it or telling a story or mechanically? What are some other challenges that people might not realize that you guys come across?
Well, a lot of it is you just have too many good ideas. It's tough. It takes an active will in some cases to pare things down to a point where it is on budget and on schedule. Yeah, you have to be responsible, even as a creator, as like a creative director or designer. You have to be respectful of the fact that these things cost money and they take time to make and they take people's effort. And I've been on games where the creative director has been negligent of that and had, like one game I worked on, they had the animator and artist like build and texture an enemy like 4 times. And this was like a
Wow.
full, like they were done and he's like, I don't like it. Let's change it. And that I thought was just irresponsible. That kind of attitude was bad because it was really affecting the animators' morale. They were like not feeling like anything they did was good. And it overall was just it was a kind of an abuse of power. And so I try to not be that. I am very mindful of what it takes to make a game. I used to, like I said, I used to be an artist and an animator, so I know what it takes to do those activities, and I know how long it takes. So they're not going to be able to pull one over on me. But conversely, I also know how long it takes, and that
Yeah.
it's a lot of effort. And so I'm always mindful of that. So often you come up with a lot of cool and fun ideas for characters or activities or environments or things like that. And you have to be careful of what's called feature creep, where people get so excited about something that they just keep adding and adding and adding. And there's a moment where you just have to say, okay, that's it. The ship has sailed. We're not adding anything new. We're just going to polish what we have.
Yeah.
And that's that some studios have gone under because they're just not able to hit the brakes like that.
Yeah. Do you still play games just on the side for your own personal enjoyment?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, all the time.
Are there any
Like I
current
said,
games?
I said I'm playing Star Wars Outlaws. I play Helldivers 2. I play Fortnite. I got back into that thanks to my buddy Hardy. Hopefully he's listening. Hi Hardy. Um, I play Marvel Snap like every day. And that's just video games. And I'm always looking at new, like when I find out about new things, I will check them out. For example, I was playing a lot of Balaltro not too long ago, which is a poker deck builder. I have a couple of other ones. I just wrote down a couple in my notebook of games that I need to check out just because somebody was raving about the mechanisms in them and all that. But I like games. in general, but I also love board games. But the tough thing about board games, of course, is you need usually more than one person to play them. So
Yeah.
I have kind of a standing date every Wednesday with some friends to play board games. I also there's a role playing game, although it's been kind of hard for me to get together on that for that. So apologies to my role playing game group, but yeah, I mean, I games are my primary form of entertainment, and they are my primary occupation.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? I want to get your thoughts on some of the more modern things that are happening in games. There's things where, game will get released for free and then they're just selling cosmetics and that's how they make their money. Or the
Right, right.
the gotcha is the term that's, always
Yeah.
going around. What are your thoughts on those kind of models?
It's really funny because the term gotcha originally was short for gachapon, which was the little prize uh, vending machines that
Mm-hmm.
they have in Japan, and they now have, you can find them in like LA and New York and stuff. But originally they were fun little extras. They weren't like critical to the game. And I think that um the best type of those add-ons, what we used to call DLC, but now it's just things that you monetize, are cosmetic. So I love games like Little Big Planet or Marvel Snap or um games that allow, or even Star Wars Outlaws have things that you can buy, but they're purely for fun. So, for example, in Marvel Snap, there are variant cards that are just different, cards by different artists. And you don't need those different art cards to play the game as long as you just have got one of those cards.
Right.
But it's fun to sometimes, like, there's an artist named Dan Hip who does a lot of cards. And so I like getting the Dan Hip cards. And there's like Jim Lee. And then they've been doing what I really thought they should have done from the start, which is to release like classic comic book covers. So you can get, if you're, Thanos card, you have the cover of the Infinity Gauntlet
Yeah.
comic or something like that, right? So for me, you don't need those, but they're fun. And because I'm an old time comic book fan, I'm like, oh, I want to get those old
Yeah.
Silver Age ones. Those are pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. When you're comparing designing something like a video game to designing a board game or a tabletop game, what do you see as similarities and differences in designing the two?
So I teach classes in video game design. And for the studio classes and sometimes the level design classes, um, I always make my students create a paper prototype. Now, you don't have to make it out of paper. You can make it out of Lego or whatever. But essentially, it is something that you build or make before you start committing it to pixels, before you start creating geometry. So it's often it is a map that you use as a guide, and the reality is that a paper prototype, to take it even as far as a board game, is really just the starting point for what becomes a video game. If you think first, I mean, if you look back at the history of video games, some of the earliest video games were either cribbing Dungeons and Dragons or Risk or Diplomacy, like those, some of the early, or Solitaire, right? Card games.
Right.
Some of the earliest video games, back on Trash 80s and Spectrums and Commodores and all that. These were just a lot of them were just the creator, the inventor's version of those classic board games or tabletop games. And then it wasn't until people started to get kind of the hang of programming and doing art and all that they started to create new genres, right? Like the adventure game is just a choose your own adventure book, right? Or even just a storytelling,
Yeah.
sitting around a fire and coming around up with a story, right? So these have all come from somewhere. There's very few genres that are unique to gaming. They can all be found in tabletop form first, or often simultaneous. And but uh so yeah, so there's the I forget what your question was.
That's all right. That's all right. Like I say beforehand, if we go off, it's okay if we go off. When you're coming up, you come up with all these video games, and a common thing that happens these days is there's a lot of video games that are getting board game spin-offs. Oh,
Right.
here's a Dead by Daylight board game.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
here's a
Yeah. Dark
Fallout
Souls,
board game.
Elden
Yeah.
Ring.
If you
Yeah.
could take
Whatever.
some of your video games, which games would you want to make into board games?
Oh man, I have been pitching to Capcom. So I made a series. I was lead designer on a series of games called Maximo. I didn't invent Maximo. That was Dave Siller, and I wasn't the first designer on the game. That was Bill Anderson. But these are guys that were friends and coworkers of mine, and I have a big respect for what they created. And I love Maximo the game. I think it was ahead of its time. I jokingly call it Dark Souls before Dark Souls
Yeah, yeah.
because
Definitely
it's
has that
hard.
feel.
Yeah, it's a hard. We were trying to emulate Ghosts and Goblins, which is also a very hard game back in the
One of
day.
my
But
favorite
we were,
impossible games to play, yeah.
that game is very hard. So we wanted to make originally a trilogy of games. So we made the first one was called Maximo Goes to Glory. The second one is Maximo versus Army of Zin. And so in both of those games, we wove this story about how Maximo had this princess that he was in love with, or queen actually, because Maximo was the king, and she gets abducted essentially by the bad guy, and Maximo doesn't know where she is, and so he spends the first game trying to get back to her. It's essentially the Odyssey. The second game is him trying to find where she is. She's somewhere. We don't know where. We know she's not in the underworld, so she's not dead. So she's somewhere out there, and so he's kind of on this this search for her. And in the process, he comes across another young lady who ends up becoming a partner, like a co, not conspirator, but like part of his team of heroes. And she falls in love with him. And at the end of the game, Maximo has to give part of his soul to her so she can live. And so now he's a guy with essentially a divided heart. He's got his queen, who he's in love with, but now his part of his heart is with this girl Tinker. And so the third game was going to be about the love triangle of Maximo, the queen, and Tinker, and kind of how that gets resolved. We didn't want to do it in a way that any of the characters got killed. We wanted to we liked the characters we had created, so
Right.
we were like, is there a way to resolve this without doing that? And so there were many design ideas that Dave Siller and I bounced around about what that could be. And then if you look online for Maximo 3, there actually was another game that was pitched and we started work on, but I never really liked that idea because it didn't fit in with the world we had already built and the story we were already telling. And it was kind of a game that was of its time, this was right after 9/11, and it had some pretty ugly stereotyping in it.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't very keen on that. And I ended up leaving the company actually. I was like, I don't really want to make this version, and so off I went. And it never got finished. So there's always been this kind of lingering third chapter of this trilogy that I wanted to make. And I was like, hey, why don't I make it as a board game? That would be awesome. So I've reached out to Capcom a few times, and they, in the past, just never got back to me. But I actually did reach somebody about 4 or 5 months ago, and they said, get back in touch with me in 6 months. And so I go, okay. So in 6 months, I will try again and see if I can maybe convince them to make the third part of the Maximo saga in board game form.
That's awesome. My follow-up question would have been, what does that look like? But I don't want you to give it away if it's actually like a
No, no.
possibility. So there
Yeah,
we
yeah,
go.
yeah. Yeah,
We'll,
fingers crossed.
we'll move on for that. Your tell us a little bit about. I'm just completely switching gears here because you have a book called Level Up,
Mhm.
and it's just releasing your third edition, right, of
Yeah,
that
yeah.
book. Tell us a little bit about what the book is and what people can find in there and what changes you made in the third edition.
Right. So Level Up came about because of two things. One was I was working for THQ as a creative manager, and I was going all around the world meeting a lot of different video game developers, and they were always asking me the same questions over and over again. And so I said, "Oh, guys, I'm so tired of answering the same questions. I'm just going to write them all down in a book. You can read my book, and then when we're done, then then we can talk, right? Because you'll have already known the answers to all the basic stuff." And at the same time, I was working with a team called Fifth Cell. They were making a DS game called Drawn to Life, which was a platformer. And at that point, I had done a lot of platform games.
Yeah.
And the creative director there was like, "Hey, Scott, can you tell me everything you know about platforming games?" And I said, "Well, no, but I can write down the basics." And so the way that I would design games is I would draw little cartoons to illustrate how these different mechanisms and whatnot worked, enemies and hazards and things like that. And so I drew what was called the platform primer, and you can find that online actually on my blog. And so I also had given a talk at the Game Developers Conference about level design in Disneyland, and it ended up being a big hit that it not only got me a job with Disney Imagineering, but it also got me a book deal. And so when I talked to the editor, the publisher at Wiley, I said, what kind of book do you want? Do you want like level design for dummies? Because Wiley is the guys that do the for dummies
Yeah.
book. They said, no, we want the Scott Rogers book of game design. And he's like, do you know what that looks like? I'm like, absolutely. I go, it's this list of questions that everybody asked me, plus the platforming primer, plus this Disneyland talk, plus. So that was Level Up. And so Level Up came out, and there's a lot of really good books out there on game design, but none of them really were practical. They were mostly, a lot of them were theoretical. A lot of people kind of say that my book is a good companion to Jesse Schell's book, which is called A Book of Lenses. And so Jesse's book is great. And so his are like, let's think about games. Mine is like, let's roll up our sleeves and make games.
Yeah.
And so if you want like kind of a good practical guide to how to go about taking an idea and turning it into a game design document that you can then use to work with the team to make a video game, I highly recommend checking out Level Up.
That's awesome. What kind of things did you add in the third edition?
Oh my gosh, so much. Because I always feel like I'm doing the audience a disservice if I don't change at least like 30 or 40% of the content in the book.
Right.
So this third edition has purple cover. The other two have other different colors. But it has two new chapters, one on virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, all that good stuff. And then the other chapter is on playtesting, how to run playtesting groups and how to get good feedback and all that. And I've included a new kind of a document that helps you questions you could ask during playtesting that will help give you the answers you need to make changes. And I also went through and updated again like 30-40% of the content, like elaborated on a lot of things, changed the examples of things to kind of modernize them. So instead of talking about a game that is 10 years old, it's now something that came out either last year or is coming out or whatever. A lot of new illustrations. There were some illustrations I just didn't like, and so I changed them, added a bunch of new ones, um, and then just kind of brushed off, kind of jettisoned some of the things that I thought were a little frivolous. And so if you still want those things, they're still available in the second edition, and in the first edition. But but I really honed the focus, and partially because of page count, to just really like make it as kind of stuffed full of useful information as possible. And then, of course, there's a brand new chili recipe because Level Up is each of the editions have a different chili recipe in them because I make a metaphor in the book about how game design is like making chili.
That's awesome. That's really cool. You have another book too. You mentioned to me earlier before we started, right?
I do. Well, I have a couple other books, but
Tell us about your other books.
I know the one you're referring to, which is called Your Turn: The Guide to Great Tabletop Game Design.
Yeah.
And that is essentially Level Up, but for tabletop game design. I've read like every book out there on tabletop game design. And again, there were a lot of good ones, but I found that they kind of boiled down into two or three camps. One of them was kind of a book of advice, which I thought was fine, but sometimes the advice were coming from people that were so advanced in their career that it wasn't really helpful for younger, novice
Yeah,
game
they wouldn't
designers.
understand what they're talking about.
Right, like, someone saying, "Oh, the way to succeed is to make a bunch of successful games for a large game company." That's not ever helpful advice for anybody.
No,
The second type of book that I found were kind of these books of lists. And there's some really good ones, like my friend Jeff Engelstein wrote a really great one that is essentially just like a list of all the mechanisms that are out there, and it's a cool book, but it doesn't really tell you how to apply them. It just lists them. So you have to be savvy enough to kind of know how to combine and what combines well with, some things combine better with others,
right.
some things don't. Um, and then the third type of book that was out there were kind of like history books. And again, I love board game history. I'm a bit of a historian myself, but there's books like Stuart Wood's Euro Games, or there's one called It's Only a Game, and I'm trying to remember who the author is of that one. But anyway, there's really some, oh, and Playing at the World, of course, by John Peterson, which is a remarkable book on the history of D&D. These are all fantastic books to read, but they don't really talk about making game. They just kind of talk about how the games were made, but not about how you would go about doing it yourself. So when it came to writing Your Turn, I'm like, well, there's definitely I think there's a need for a book that walks people through, whether they're a novice or a veteran, walks them through designing games. Like, what is the creative process of designing a game? And then
Right.
how do you go about taking an idea and changing it so that it's your own? And so Your Turn is filled with, it's got lists of mechanics like those other books, and it's got some history in it like those other books, and it's got um, well, there's no interviews or anything in it, but it does have essentially it's a workbook. There's lots of space to write in and kind of write things down. And what the kind of the main thesis of the book is that um the best way to learn something is to copy, and there's no sin in copying, as long as you're not, like I said, as long as you're not ripping somebody off.
Yeah.
And so what I have done is I've created 6 original games, because I'm insane, because not only am I writing a book and drawing all the pictures, but now I'm inventing original board games for it. And then what we do is we walk our way through the games and go, okay, let's change a number, let's change an objective, let's change the theme, let's change a rule. How does that make the game different? And then I just essentially I keep telling the reader, keep changing, keep changing, keep changing. That's how you're going to make it your own game, or how you're going to come up with your own idea for a game. And
Yeah.
so by the time the reader is done reading Your Turn, they will have had 6 original games that they've created that they can use as springboards for their own designs. So
That's
I'm
really cool.
I'm I'm looking forward to seeing readers. The book's only a year old, so I'm looking forward to people saying, "Hey, I made this game, and oh, by the way, it started as this game that I did in from Your Turn."
That's awesome. That's cool. I can't wait. I'm gonna go get that book. We talked about it earlier off stream, off video, off podcast about the whole thing, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna have to go check that one out because all my research today, I ran across your other one, but I didn't run across that one, so I'm very
Yeah,
excited to go in.
and they're all available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever your favorite book is sold. And if you do purchase it, I ask everybody to please write a review, because that's what really helps authors. Particularly like on Amazon, I think you have to hit like 50 reviews before the algorithm kicks in where your book kind of shows up.
Yeah,
And so I think I'm at like 21 right now, so I need another 20 or 30 some odd reviews to get that algorithm to kick in.
there you go, audience. Go and give reviews. Get the
That's
books and
right.
get reviews.
Preferably good ones.
You've got a bunch of other projects and stuff coming up. Talk about these short run games you mentioned to me earlier that you do
Oh,
these little tiny short run games and get them out to the world.
yeah. So last year I had a pretty severe illness. I had cancer, Hodgkin's lymphoma, and then I got a bone marrow transplant to essentially try to kick that out of my system. And so I was kind of laid up on disability for several months, a couple of months for the cancer, and then another 5 or 6 months for the bone marrow transplant. And of course, during that time, you're not allowed to work with the, you know, your company. It's
Yeah.
a HR violation. So I had to make something, a project for me to do. And so during cancer, actually Comic-Con was coming around, and like I said, I used to I've been to most of the Comic-Cons. I've missed a few, but I've been to most of them. And as Comic-Con was rolling around, I was getting a little homesick for it. And I was doing kind of daily events where I was like, I will draw some sketches. You name a character, I will draw a sketch for you. Hey, send me $10 and I'll send you a bag full of comic books, or,
Yeah.
you know, whatever, things like that. And then the last day of the real con, I said, "Oh, I'll design a board game if you send me." I think it was like $60, and then like $17 for shipping or something like that. I said, "I'll send you this board game." I go, "I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to have dice and a ghost in it. That's all I know about it." And so what I did was I started to on this was on Facebook. I started to chronicle the creation process of making this game. My goal that I set for myself was to get it delivered by Halloween. And I think I started it in like August or something like that. So I had like what, 3 months to get this game done. So I just kind of put my nose to the grindstone because I had nothing better to do other than to get chemotherapy and heal. And I designed this game and got it. I got it out the week of Halloween. One person got it in time for Halloween. Everybody else got it like November 2nd or something like that. So I consider that a win.
That's awesome.
Um, but I had so much fun doing it. I said, well, I want to do this again. So I will do, so in the spring, like around April or so, I said, all right, I'm going to do another game. Um, and I don't know what it is, but all I know it's going to have a wind-up dinosaur, like this kind of wind-up kaiju in it. And so I did the same thing. I chronicled the creation of my thought process. I showed my sketchbook. I always carry a sketchbook with me, and I write down game ideas in it. And I've got like, I think I'm up to volume 53 or something insane like that. But but I was showed, you know, this is the thought process that I'm going through, and this is what I'm designing, and here's the sketches I'm making to kind of help inspire me. And eventually I ended up designing a game, and it's called Oh No, There Goes Tokyo. And you can find it on boardgamegeek.com. It's the listing for it, but there's only 30 of them in existence. I wanted to make something that was kind of bespoke. So again, it was this thing where I said, all right, who is in? Who's in? I'm going to make how many, I'll make as many of these things until this certain time. I think I was trying to hit 30 actually. So
Okay.
I'm like, let's see if we can hit 30, or maybe it might have been 25, and then I bumped it up to 30 because people were like, can we please, can we please get on board? I said, okay, all right. I'm an easy touch when it comes to that.
Yeah.
So I ended up making 30 of these. It's essentially it's a like a financial game. I say it's acquire with a giant kaiju, wind up kaiju in it. And so you're building buildings in Tokyo and you're getting rent from it, and that allows you to build your buildings higher and you can buy more property and all this. But then at the end of every round, when everybody has kind of built everything and all that, then you wind up this kaiju and you set it off and it knocks over the buildings. The buildings are made out of cubes, so they'll knock over pretty easily. And it's just ridiculous, silly fun, and people have fallen in love with it. And then when I was working on the prototype, I had done all the art myself because like I said, I'm a cartoonist, and
Yeah.
that's how I communicate game designs. And I said, should I like go out and try to hire an artist to do the art for this? And everybody went, no, we want your art. And I'm like, great, now I've got to do all the art for this game too. So I did all the art. I did the and I also used it as a learning exercise because I wanted to deal with a publisher or a printer who could manufacture, the box and manufacture the all those kind of things. And so I ended up working with Panda, and they ended up being a really great partner. And so I made it, and I just shipped it out last week, and excuse me, almost everybody has got their copy now, and they're starting to send me pictures of them playing it or opening up the box or whatever, and it's great fun. So I'm like, well, I want to do it again, but I have to figure out like what the challenge is for
Right.
myself. Like part of me wants to do something that I can do a lot of? Like, can I make 100? Can I make 1,000? Whatever.
Right.
Can I make, more of a number like a true publisher would make? Or is it something that I can have made, all the components go into the box, and then the box is sealed, and so when I get it from the manufacturer, from the printer, I can just open it up and it's exactly how I want it to be,
Yeah.
right? So it's because those are two both totally different types of challenges. Now, the irony is that all game publishers have to do both.
Yeah.
I don't know how they can do both and keep their sanity, but they do. But for me, I'm kind of taking it one step at a time because it's a learning experience, and I don't want to make mistakes. The last game I went a bit over budget on, and I'm trying not to make that mistake again. So it's so they're as much for me as they are for anybody else. Although I will be taking both games with me. I'm going to be going to Gamma this year. I've never been before, but
Okay.
but it's supposedly one of the three good shows to go to if you want to try to sell games. And so I will be bringing Oh No, There Goes Tokyo, and then Escape from Rotter Mansion is the Ghost dice game, and then a few others that I've been working on.
Okay. Cool. Cool. And that's in February in Gamma for people that
Yeah, I'm
are
very going to
looking.
Kentucky in February. I've never been to Kentucky before. I don't. Well, it's be a new experience for me.
Yeah, for sure. And if people want to find you online, they can find you on Instagram at Mighty Bedbug, right?
Yep,
Facebook
that's
at /Scott Rogers Designer. Blue
yep.
Sky, of course, Scott Rogers at Scott Rogers on Blue Sky. And of course on LinkedIn. If you guys are on LinkedIn and over there, you can find Scott Rogers Designer over there at LinkedIn. So
Yep.
go
I'm all
and
over the place.
go and check
Just
them
put
out all over.
just put in Scott Rogers game designer in Google, and an obscene amount of content will come
Yeah,
up.
you'll get lots of links. I think Board Game Geek is the first one that pops up for me.
Oh,
And
is it really?
yep,
Oh,
I think
that's
Board
good.
Game Geek is on there. Amazon shows up with your book. It's like the third or fourth one. So if you guys
Yeah.
want to go in there and get the books, buy them, rate and review the books, you guys can do that as well.
The only
They're
thing I don't have is a Wikipedia listing, and that has been eluding me for years. So if anybody out there knows how to do a Wikipedia page and have it, uh, you know, not get dumped by the mods, I would appreciate that.
Yeah, you have to hire like a third party Wikipedia
Yeah,
editor
you can't
to
you
do
can't
it.
do it yourself.
Yep.
It's considered bad form
Yes, it
to
is. They'll just
submit
take it
your
down
own.
right away if you do that.
Yep,
So
yep.
guys, go check out all of Scott Rogers' things: video games, board games, books, you name it. He's done it. I want to let you guys all know coming up, we're going to have Jim Zub is going to be joining us. He's a renowned writer and artist known for his comic books, but his work has also been seen in DC, Marvel, Disney, Capcom, Hasbro, Namco, and the Cartoon Network. He's going to be joining us live December 16th. That podcast will be available on the 17th. Also coming up, the returns of game designer Matt Forbeck's going to be joining us again. And of course, author Kevin Hearn is also going to be joining us, both of them return guests to Epic Realms. So please stick around. Make sure to subscribe, follow all of those buttons, push all of the buttons. It definitely helps us. And of course, make sure to go ahead and rate and review, just like we talked about Scott's books. For the podcast, that works the same exact way. The algorithm loves those ratings and reviews, so get those in there for the show. It not only helps us, but it also helps our guests. So for Scott Rogers, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.